Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Devon's live immigration Q&A session. We are really excited to have you with us today. As folks are joining in, it would be fantastic to hear from you in the chat, to share a little bit about who you are and kind of build your network here in this space as well. Welcome, everyone. So today we have with us Ziah Sumar. Ziah is a barrister, solicitor, and partner at Mangalji LLP. And I will be your moderator today. My name is Zora Lakhani, and I'm so excited to have everyone today with us. We will get started with just letting you know a little bit of the logistical aspects of today's session. So all participants are muted. You should be able to hear us via your computer or device audio. No need to use your video. This session will be recorded and will be shared with all registrants by email. We ask that you please post questions using the Q&A function at any time, and the chat will not be monitored for questions, but the Q&A will. So I will continue to remind you to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to please ask questions directed to Ziah. And we invite you to please check out our future sessions listed under the events tab at www.devont.ca/all-events. or in your school's portal. And I will make sure to share that link with you in the chat so that you all have it. And then I would like to just give you a quick understanding of Devont. I'm sure many of you already have perhaps attended previous sessions with us, but we wanted to let you know a little bit about Devont so that you can also share this with your colleagues and your friends. So at Devont, we help international students and alumni stay, work, and succeed in Canada. Devont is a French word, and it quite literally means to be out in front of. And we feel that we can help you get ahead of the competition and in front of many of the employers that you are looking to work with here in Canada so that you can advance your career. We offer free live career development events, online resume tools, virtual hiring expos, and biweekly newsletters to support the broader community. And we invite you to please check out our website for more details, devont.ca, which I'll also share in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Ziah to please go ahead and introduce yourself and go ahead and get started. Thanks, Ziah. Really excited to have you here with us, and I'm sure the folks on the call today are looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Zora, and I'm excited to be here again as well. As Zora mentioned, I'm a partner at Mangalji, so we're a boutique immigration law firm. So as you can imagine, today's topic is going to be all about immigration law and what you need to know as international students. So with that, I'm going to jump right in. First, I want to talk about temporary residence. Okay, so for those of you who are already here in Canada, studying, you may be already working, really important that while you're here, you do maintain your status so that you make sure you have your temporary residence status anytime that you're in Canada. Now, how do you do that? Well, you've been issued a study permit or a work permit, and on that permit itself, there's an expiry date. Really important, circle that date in your calendar, put a big red box around it, make sure that you have every alarm set. You want to know when that date is coming up. You do not want to miss that date. So whatever you need to do, check that date, put it in every calendar that you have, and really do flag it. The reason being is that before this date, you need to make sure that you're applying to extend or change your status while you're here in Canada. Now, as long as you submit an extension application prior to that expiry date that's listed on your study permit or on your work permit, you'll have what's called implied or maintained status. This means that you can continue studying or working in Canada pursuant to the conditions of your previous permit. And that allows you to continue doing that until you receive a decision on your extension application. So, for example, if you have a study permit and it's expiring on December 1st, and you've attended these sessions before, you know that you need to apply to extend it, and so you submitted your extension application on November 28th, for example. Well, what that means is that on December 2nd, you'll still be here in Canada. You'll still be able to continue studying while you wait for a decision on that extension application. But really important, you only get implied status, you only get maintained status as long as you submit that extension application and you apply properly. Now, a question I often get is IRCC's website says that I need to submit my extension applications a month in advance. I didn't know that. And so now, we're at November 28th and my permit expires on December 1st. Does this mean that I won't get status or implied status? And the answer is no. By law, your extension application just has to be submitted before the expiry of your current permit. So submitting it on November 28th while your permit expires on December 1st is completely fine. Okay. So I know IRCC's website says it needs to be submitted a month in advance. And while that's great, it's not the law. The law is that you have to submit the extension application prior to the expiry of your permit. Now, despite all those alarms and flags that you have in your calendar, what happens if you miss that deadline? What happens if you pull up your study permit on December 2nd and realize, oops, I missed that expiry date? Well, you have what's called a period to restore your status. So that means where you've lost your status, IRCC does give you a grace period to apply to get your status back. The restoration timeline right now is 90 days. So from the date that you lost your status, you have a period of 90 days to apply to get your status back. Now, the biggest difference with the restoration application, one, it's more expensive, but two, and more importantly, is that when you submit a restoration application, you don't have status currently. And so what that means is that you can't actually continue studying or working while you're waiting for a decision on that restoration application. So going back to our example, if December 2nd comes around, you realize that, oh, wait, my permit actually expired on December 1st. Now I don't have status. What that's going to mean is that you actually have to stop studying immediately, submit that restoration application, but you will not be able to start studying or return back to school until you have a decision on that restoration application. And so that means, unfortunately, that there's going to be a period of time where you won't be able to work or you won't be able to study in Canada until a decision is made. And right now, processing times have gotten really long. So extension applications, restoration applications are taking about 5 months. And so it's quite a period of time to not be able to work or study. During that restoration period, you have to remain in Canada in order for that restoration application to continue processing. If you exit Canada, that means that that restoration application is technically invalid. And so you would be looking at applying for a new study permit or a new work permit. So all that to say, really important, make sure that you know what the expiry date is that's listed on your study permit, apply before it. If for whatever reason you do miss it, though, there is a period to restore your status. Now, that's speaking specifically to the expiry date that's listed on your permit. There's also conditions that IRCC has for your study permit that are not actually listed there. They're implied upon you. And one of the ones that I find that are most confusing and really does catch a lot of people is that you do have to be actively pursuing your studies. So an implied condition on your study permit is that you are always actively pursuing your studies while you're here in Canada. And what that means is that you're always making progress towards the completion of your program. If you stop studying for whatever reason, if it's that you're done your program early, or you decide you no longer want to study in Canada, your study permit becomes invalid either 90 days following when you stop studying or the expiry date of your permit, whichever comes first. So if you have a study permit right now that's valid until, let's say, 2024, but you decide tomorrow to stop studying, that doesn't mean that you have status as a student until 2024, 2025, whenever your permit expires. You actually, that permit that you hold, the study permit, becomes invalid 90 days following whenever you stop studying. So really important, while you're here in Canada, one of the implied conditions on the study permit is that you're actively pursuing your studies. Now, there are two exceptions to that rule. The first is if you're on a regularly scheduled break, and the second is if you're on an authorized leave. Now, what does that all mean? Well, a regularly scheduled break is any break that's actually in the academic calendar for your program at your school. So for example, if you're doing a 4-year bachelor's degree and the way that the school has set up the program is the fall and winter semester is in class and summer semesters are off, then the IRCC follows that same schedule. And so during your scheduled break, during that summer semester, you would not need to be actively pursuing your studies and you would still keep your status on your study permit. So the first exception is if you're on a regularly scheduled break. Now, when we talk about regularly scheduled breaks, it is really referring to the school's academic calendar for your program. If your school doesn't have any scheduled breaks in your program, so for example, if you're doing a 2-year intensive program which doesn't have any summer breaks or any semesters off, then you also would not have any scheduled breaks as well. If you decide to take a scheduled break, so for example, if you decide to take a semester where you don't register in any courses, that's going to be a problem because due to the academic calendar saying that this is not a scheduled break, if you take that time off, if you decide to not register for courses in that semester, you would actually be in breach of that condition to be actively pursuing your studies. So really important. The first, when we talk about actively pursuing studies, the first is a regularly scheduled break, and IRCC defers to your school's academic calendar for your program. The second exception is if you're on an authorized leave. Now, what an authorized leave is one that's been approved by your school. It can be for a variety of reasons. For example, if you need time off due to medical concerns or for a family emergency, you do have to let your school know. Your school does have to actually authorize it. I do recommend having it in writing because you will need it for further applications. But that is really the second exception. And so if you're on an authorized leave that's been approved by the school, then you will not lose your status while you're here in Canada. With that being said, though, if your authorized leave is greater than 150 days, so it's longer than 150 days, and you're remaining in Canada, you do have to change your status for anything beyond that 150-day mark. So let's say you've taken an authorized leave for a full academic year, and you're remaining in Canada during that time, well, you do need to make sure that you're changing your status to visitor, for example, for anything beyond that 150-day mark. Now, with your study permit, most of you probably already know that you do have the ability to work while you're studying. So, who can work? When can you work? This has become a very big question recently due to IRCC's wonderful announcements that they made last month. So let's talk about it. Now, the way that I like to explain the ability to work is I break it up between the rules pre-October 7th and since October 7th. So pre-October 7th, and this is the default rule, is that full-time students are able to work off campus up to 20 hours a week during their academic semesters and full-time during any regularly scheduled breaks. Okay, so as long as you're a full-time student, you're able to use your study permit to work off campus up to 20 hours a week during the semester and full-time during any scheduled break. Now, on October 7th, IRCC made a huge announcement saying that between November 15th of this year and December 31st of next year of 2023, full-time students are able to work during their academic semester without any restriction. So that 20-hour cap has been lifted for anyone who is studying full-time for the period of November 15th to December 31st, 2023. Now, with that being said, of course, there are certain restrictions as to who actually qualifies for this temporary policy. Now, anyone who is in Canada with a study permit, who applied for their study permit or had been approved for their study permit prior to October 7th is eligible for this program. That was the initial announcement that IRCC made on October 7th. That's what the policy has been stating. So what that meant is if you applied for your study permit October 10th, you're outside of Canada, you're waiting for a decision, unfortunately, the policy will not apply to you. Earlier today, IRCC made a further announcement on this. And so they've released further instructions as to what it means or who they meant to include in this policy, basically providing further details on people who were here in Canada, potentially had an extension application in process, needed to apply for extension, or will need to apply for an extension anytime between October 7th and December 31st, 2023. I'll be very honest with you, the announcement today is not very clear as to who actually qualifies and who doesn't. And so we have already, as a firm, we've already reached out to IRCC to try and figure out what it all means. And so I know many of you, if you're here in Canada, are going to be asking the question of, I have a study permit that expires on, insert date, December 9th, 2022, for example. I applied to extend it later, maybe it was November 30th, for example. Do I qualify to work full time? And, the honest answer right now is that we really don't know. Like I said, the further instruction that was just released earlier today made it very confusing and really did make it unclear as to who can and can't work. Right now, what we know is that anyone who, if you have a study permit that's valid beyond December 31st, 2023, you held your study permit before October 7th, you're fine. You can work on that temporary policy. If you have a study permit that's expiring between that November 15th and December 31st, that's where right now it's a little unclear when you can work up until. So, stay tuned. Devon definitely does have many of these sessions, these immigration sessions. And so I'm hoping by the next one, we do have some further clarity in terms of who can and can't work. So stay tuned on that one. But that's where we're at right now. Now,
Ziah, sorry,
yes,
just sorry for cutting you off there.
no problem.
Where should folks go in order to get the most updated information? Like which website? I just went on to Google IRCC News Today study permit, and I'm still trying to figure out where I would navigate myself to just to find today's news, for example, let alone the October 7 announcement and prior to that. So which websites are the most
it's confusing because it's it would be great if IRCC just said, okay, here's the one page that we have where everything for students is going to be placed, and there just isn't. IRCC's website is quite confusing in terms of where students should go, where this new information is always posted. And so it can be on a variety of different pages on IRCC's website. This particular one was it's on there. I can pull it up later and send out the link, but it's on their policies for off-campus work. And so that was updated earlier today. And so that's where we were able to see that it's just not clear anymore. But yeah, IRCC's website's really where to go. I know Devon has a newsletter, and usually that does have some information in there too about updates. So that's always another great resource. As a firm, so like I said, I'm a partner at Mangalji. Our firm does also send out immigration updates as it happens. So we did send one out for international students on October 7th when that change came up. And so, different resources, unfortunately, not one specific page to go to, but yeah.
That's helpful, Ziah. And I just wanted
to answer, unfortunately.
I know that folks who have registered for this session will be able to access the Devon newsletter. Is there a way to join Long Mangalji's newsletter?
Yeah, if you go on our website, it's www.lmlawgroup.com. You can sign up for a newsletter. It's right on, I believe it's on the homepage, so it should be somewhere there.
Fantastic. I'll share the link there. Sorry to cut you off there.
That's
but
okay.
Thanks, Ziah. Gave you an opportunity to drink some water there.
Yeah, exactly. It was perfect. Great. And so, going back to working on the study permit, whether, you fall under the temporary policy, whether you're not part of the temporary policy, that whole ability to work on your study permit is still dependent on being a full-time student. And so what that means is that your ability to work off campus using your study permit ends as soon as you stop studying. Okay, so as soon as you're no longer a full-time student, you cannot work using your study permit. Now, for some of you, that's going to be very clear, because let's say you decide to end your program early, you decide to no longer pursue it, very clear when you stop studying, and so you know that you can no longer work. But for those of you who are finishing your program, you're in your final semester, question I always get is, when am I considered to be done? When do I have to stop studying? Stop working. Well, the answer to that is as soon as you receive any written confirmation that you've completed the requirements of your program, and so you're no longer a student, that's when you have to stop working. So if we go through an example, let's say you're in your final semester, you're doing your final exams, you've completed your final exam, but you haven't yet received your final grades. Well, at that point in time, you're still considered a full-time student. You're still considered a student, just because you have not yet received any indication that you've completed your program. Once you've received any communication, and that can be a letter from the school, it can be an email from the school, it can be your final grades being released, your final transcripts, anything that confirms to you that you've completed your program, that's the point in time where you're no longer a student and you do have to stop working. Okay, and that applies to both pre-October 7th and with the temporary policy, you have to stop working. When I talk about final grades, I know a lot of people will always ask me, well, what if I just don't check my grades? Does that mean that I can continue working? And unfortunately, the answer is no. If your grades are released, whether or not you decide to check them, you are still considered to be completed your program. And so you do have to stop working. So really important to be aware of what's happening.
On that front too, Zia, one of the questions that I've been asked as well is not just about releasing of the grades, but the end of course work, like your last class versus the time you graduate. So even the releasing of the grades is at a different period too. So last class, release of grades, and then graduation. Just clarifying those periods as well.
Yeah, so when you do let's say you're in a course-based program, you finish your last course, you still have exams. At that point, you're still a student. So at that point, you can continue working. Okay. You do your final exam, still no grades released, so you don't know if you've passed or not. At that point, you're still a student. You can still continue working. Okay. As soon as there's any indication to you that you've completed your program, like I said, it can be an email from the school, it can be your final grades, anything that tells you, congrats, you've finished this program, that's where you're no longer a student, and that's when you have to stop working. Okay, your graduation ceremony, all of that is usually much later, so we don't usually look at that date because it's so much further down the line, and you really do have to stop working well before that. So usually we look at these first instances as indications of when you have to stop working. Okay. If you're doing multiple programs, so let's say you're finishing your first program and you're looking to start a second program, as long as you've already been accepted in the second program and you still hold your valid study permit, or you've already applied for your extension, you can work in between your programs as long as the duration of time between those two programs is less than 150 days. So when you finish program one, you've received your confirmation that you've completed the program, but you've already been accepted into that second program, and that's what you're going to be doing in the next semester per se, then you can work full-time between programs without issue, even though you're no longer a full-time student during that intermediate period. Okay. Once you're done your program, of course, the next step is applying for your postgrad work permit. Really important, you only qualify for a postgrad work permit once in your life. So do be aware in terms of when you're applying for it and whether it makes the most sense for you. For the postgrad work permit, the length of it will coincide with the length of your program of study. So if you do a program that's anywhere between 8 months to 2 years, then your work permit, your postgrad work permit, will be valid for that same period of time. So if you do a 1-year program, you'd be eligible for a 1-year postgrad work permit. If you do a program that's 2 years or longer, then you're eligible for the maximum duration of work permit, which is 3 years. If you combine programs, if you complete 2 programs, you can combine them together to qualify for that maximum duration. So let's say you do 2 one-year programs, those can be combined together to have a total education of 2 years in Canada, which would make you eligible for that 3-year postgrad work permit. Okay. Now, when you're applying for a postgrad work permit, really important, and this is the one where I see most people have, unfortunately, come to us when they're done their program and they realize that later that it is an issue, is that to be eligible for the postgrad work permit, you have to have been a full-time student in every semester of your program. Okay. The only exceptions to that are if you're on an authorized leave or if you're in your final semester of your program. Otherwise, in every other semester, you do have to be a full-time student. Okay, this is really important. If for whatever reason you become a part-time student for a semester, that affects your eligibility for the postgrad work permit. What ends up happening is that when you're applying for the postgrad, you're explaining the reason for why you became part-time, and you have to ask for the discretion of the officer to grant the postgrad work permit. Basically, it means that you're technically no longer eligible, and at that point, you're at the mercy of the officer. So to avoid all that stress when you get to the postgrad stage, it's really important that while you're studying, make sure you're always registered as a full-time student. When we talk about the definition of full-time status, it's dependent on the school again. So IRCC defers to the school to determine who is considered a full-time student. So how many courses you need and whatnot. With that being said, like I said, the 2 exceptions are if you're on authorized leave or if you're in your final semester of your program. Okay. Now, when you apply for your postgrad work permit, okay, you're actually able to start working full-time as soon as you apply for your work permit, as long as your study permit is valid on the day of your postgrad work permit application, and if you're applying within the 90-day period following the completion of your program. So what does that mean? If we go back to the examples that we talked about earlier when we were looking at when you can work on your study permit. So we said that for someone who was doing courses, they finished their final course, they finished the final class, they could continue working. They did their exam, they could continue working. Their final grade was released, and now they've completed their program of study, they have to stop working, right? You can no longer work once you're no longer a full-time student. But as soon as you apply for your postgrad work permit, if you hold a study permit on that date, a valid study permit, when you submit that postgrad application, you can start working full-time. So even though that postgrad application is in process, you don't have a decision on it, you're able to start working full-time while you're waiting for your work permit application to be processed by IRCC. Okay, so really important, because when you're looking at, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but applying for permanent residence, of course, you want to be working to start gaining the time. And so you are able to start working full-time as soon as that postgrad work permit application is filed. Okay. All right. That's temporary residence. Now, before I move into permanent residence, I do want to talk a little bit about the recent changes to the NOC system, the National Occupation Classification System. So what is that? Well, IRCC has, again, in theory, has a system. It's called the National Occupation Classification System. And they've taken all occupations and codified them between different skill levels. So before November, before this month, the way that the system was set up was that every occupation had a 4-digit code, and each of those 4-digit codes were classified as skill level O, A, B, C, or D. Anyone whose code fell under NOC O, A, or B was considered high skilled. Anyone whose codes fall under NOC C or D were considered low skilled. Now, as of this month, that system changed to the tier system, the TEER system, okay? And it's broken down into 6 categories. anything, so it goes from from tier 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, the definition of high skilled is all occupations that fall under NOCs 0, 1, 2, and 3. Low skilled is anything that falls under tiers 4 and 5. Okay. Now, this has been, so some of the occupations, so everything has moved from this 4-digit to the 6-digit system. And what has happened is that some occupations that were previously considered low skilled are now considered high skilled. So occupations like nurse aides, personal support workers, dental assistants, truck drivers, heavy equipment operators, tattoo artists, all of these last month were considered to be low skilled occupations. As of now, because of the tier system, they're now considered high skilled. So there's a total of 16 occupations that have moved from the low skilled, that have entirely moved from low skilled to high skilled. There's also some occupations that have unfortunately gone the other way, so that they have moved from what was considered high skilled and are now considered low skilled. So there's occupations like program leaders in sports and fitness, court clerks, some performers, tailors. These occupations last month were considered to be high skilled and are now unfortunately low skilled. You can find a full list of all the occupations and how they've changed. It's all on IRCC's website, on the NOC website. So really important to check that out. And we'll talk about why in a moment when we look at the permanent residence. But, as you're working in Canada, you want to be checking to say what your occupation is, where you fall under, because that really determines what options are available to you when you're applying for permanent residence. Okay, on that note, let's look at what permanent residence is and how we go about applying for it. So when we're talking about applying for permanent residence, there's two real categories of applications when we're looking through the economic programs. You can either be applying through the federal programs, or you can be looking at the provincial nominee programs. I'm first going to focus on some of the popular federal programs, and then we'll take a quick moment to talk about the provincial nominee programs. So federally, there's three main programs. There's the Federal Skilled Worker, Canadian Experience Class, and Skilled Trades. Most of you are probably going to be looking at either the Federal Skilled Worker or the Canadian Experience Class program. Now, the biggest difference between these two is where you've completed your work experience. So the Federal Skilled Worker program requires at least 1 year of continuous high-skilled work experience in a single occupation within the past 10 years. If we break that down, just take a moment to talk about that a little bit. So what that means is that the Federal Skilled Worker program, you need at least a year of experience, but that year of experience has to be continuous, which means it can't have any breaks in it. It has to be in the same occupation, so you can't combine different positions or different types of work together, and it has to be within the past 10 years. Comparatively, when we're looking at the Canadian Experience Class program, you need 1 year of high-skilled work experience in Canada that you've obtained while not a student and not self-employed, and it has to be within the past 3 years. So when we compare these, we don't see anything about it being continuous. So that means in the Canadian Experience Class program, you can combine different occupations together. You can have breaks between your different jobs. All of that is fine as long as you're using different high-skilled positions together. However, the work experience has to be in Canada, and it can't be self-employed work experience or work experience that you've obtained while you're a student. Okay. Also, the period of time is 3 years rather than the 10 years for the skilled worker program. Now, there are other requirements for each of these programs, but I'm not going to go through everything in detail right now. If you're eligible for either of these programs or for the skilled trades program, the way that the applications are now processed is through a system called Express Entry. So many of you have probably heard of the term Express Entry and are wondering how you use it. How do you apply for permanent residence through Express Entry? Well, it's really important to understand Express Entry is not a program in itself. It's the management system for the federal programs, like the federal skilled worker and the Canadian Experience Class programs. So what that means is that you have to be eligible under one of the 3 federal programs. And then from there, once you're eligible, you can start using the express entry system to apply. In the express entry system, the first thing you're doing is you're creating a profile. You're going into a pool of candidates. In this pool, you're given a score out of 1,200. And what IRCC is doing is they're taking that score and they're ranking everyone using that score. From there, IRCC does draws, and right now we're seeing it about every other week. They do draws and they set a minimum score. Based on that minimum score, they're sending out what are called invitations to apply. So it's a letter that basically says you are now invited to apply for permanent residence. So what's really important to understand is creating a profile, going into the pool of candidates. That is not an application for permanent residence. That's basically saying to IRCC, you're interested in becoming a permanent resident. You can't actually submit your full application until you get an invitation. So what that means is that your score in the pool is very important. Okay, that's really what determines who gets an invitation and who doesn't. So who actually has the ability to apply for permanent residence through express entry and who does not. Once you have your invitation, you have a period of 60 days to prepare and submit your permanent residence application. From there, IRCC processes it. And well, in theory, the average processing time is supposed to be 6 months. Now, let's talk about the draws a little bit. I don't want to spend too much time because I know we're nearing our hour mark. So I do want to make sure we get a chance to answer your questions as well. But really important, during COVID, what we saw was that IRCC went and did, for a period of time, they were doing program-specific draws. So anyone who qualified under a provincial nominee program or a Canadian Experience Class, that was really who IRCC focused on. And so what that meant was that the minimum scores required decreased significantly. We saw draws in the 300s. Because of the backlogs, because of the processing times, IRCC actually stopped doing invitations, stopped doing draws for Canadian Experience Class as well for a period of about 10 months. And so they've only restarted doing general draws again as of July of this year. And so when they started doing draws in July, the minimum scores required were above 500. Now, because we've seen regular draws and because the scores, because the size of the draws did increase over the last couple of months, we've now seen it come down significantly. It's now in about 491, I think was the last draw. And so we are seeing it come down, but, whether we're going to see it come back down to pre-COVID levels, which was about 460s, 470s, it's very hard to say at this point in time. The other thing that IRCC has already talked about doing in the new year, and we don't have an exact date, this is not confirmed. This is not confirmed. We don't know when it's going to happen or if it's for sure going to happen. But IRCC has talked about doing occupation-specific draws or further program-specific draws. So what does that all mean? Well, if you qualify, if you are eligible under one of the 3 federal programs, you may want to consider still going into the pool, right? Even if your score is lower, it may still be beneficial to be in the pool because we never know what's going to happen with IRCC. If they start doing occupation-specific draws, what occupations they're going to pick, how often they're going to do it, all of that right now is unknown. And so, it goes back to the saying, you miss 100% of those shots that you don't take. And so, if you're not in the pool, you definitely cannot be selected. But if you are in the pool and they do another draw or they do a draw for your particular occupation, that's something that you may benefit from. The biggest lesson that came out of this was in February. During the February 2021, they did a draw, IRCC did a massive draw of 25,000 people, and the minimum score for that draw was 75. And, I don't know if we're ever going to see that again, but, pre that particular draw, someone who had a score of 100, we would have never said, okay, it makes sense to go in the pool. But, anyone who was in the pool definitely did benefit because the IRCC just randomly did that massive draw. And, it's not something that they announce in advance. It's not something that they publish to say, we're going to be doing this, get into the pool. We're going to be selecting these occupations. We're going to be looking at only this particular program. None of that, unfortunately, is announced in advance. So, something to think about in terms of looking at your options.
And Zia, for
Yeah.
that, can you edit your profile to, because I know part of your point accumulation has to do with experience or like scoring on your TOEFL exam or whatever it might be. And am I right? From
Yes,
what
you're
I remember.
100% right.
And so
Exactly.
if something changes and I go into my profile and update it, it might adjust my score. But am I allowed to update once I'm in the pool?
Yep. So
Great.
when you create your profile, you go into the pool, your profile is valid for a year. And so at any point in that year, you can go in and update it. So let's say you go in, your language scores are not that high the first test you did, and so you want to retake it. You can still go into the pool, and then when you've retaken your test, when you have those additional language scores that are higher, you can always go in and update it. You can update any part of your profile. And in fact, IRCC encourages that and expects that you are constantly updating your profile as there are any changes.
And when you said up to a year, that profile is valid. After the year, you have to just resubmit?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's no maximum, like if you're in the pool, you don't get selected in the first year, you can recreate, the profile just expires, but you can certainly go back, recreate a new profile and go into the pool again. There's nothing limiting that's saying, okay, you can only do this 3 times, for example. You can do it as many times as you want. Hopefully you've already become a permanent resident well before then, but yeah, certainly you can create a profile again if it expires. Okay. In terms of points and what that all looks like, the comprehensive ranking system, which is what IRCC uses to score people in the pool, there's many different factors that go into it. I'm not going to go into the complete breakdown, but I'll go over it in a very high level. IRCC looks at your age, and unfortunately, the maximum points are awarded to anyone between 20 and 29. As soon as you turn 30, from an immigration point of view, it's no longer a happy birthday because your points are decreasing every year. So unfortunately, I don't, anyways, at 30, your points start to decrease up until 45 when you don't get any more points for your age. So apply soon if you do qualify. It does help to go into the pool earlier rather than later. But yeah, so that's one part is age. The other is education. You get scores, you get points for your language, both your first and second. Again, I'm talking only about English and French because we're talking about the official languages, but the scores that you receive on your language tests, that can give you points in the pool. Any Canadian work experience you have that's high skilled, any work experience you have that's outside of Canada that's high skilled, both of those can count, and those are 2 separate categories of points. If you have a spouse, your spouse's education, your spouse's language proficiency, and their Canadian work experience also does count for points. If you have a provincial nomination, which we'll talk about in a moment, that can give you points. If you've studied in Canada, if you have a sibling who is a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, if you're fluent in French, all of these are different categories of points that you can get in the comprehensive ranking system. There's also a category for what's called arranged employment. I want to spend a moment on this because we always get questions about this. So arranged employment, what that means. IRCC awards points, either 50 or 200 points, depending on your NOC code. But what arranged employment is if you either have, this is what colloquially people call a job offer, right? If you have a job offer, you get points. Well, it's not as simple as just saying I have a piece of paper, my employer has written a letter saying I have a job offer, so now I want those 50 points. That's not what IRCC qualifies for points. When we're talking about arranged employment, either you have a labor market impact assessment or you're on a closed work permit. So that means an employer-specific work permit, which is not a postgrad work permit. You're on that closed work permit. You've worked for your employer for a year and you hold a position with them for a longer period of time. Okay, so really important when we talk about arranged employment, we talk about the points for job offer. IRCC is very specific in what qualifies for those points. And generally, someone on a postgrad work permit would not qualify for those additional points. Okay. I want to talk quickly about provincial nominee programs. So when we look at applying for permanent residence, what IRCC has done is said to every province, okay, province, you create programs to help facilitate permanent residence in your province, in your regions, okay? The granting of permanent residence is still federal, so it's still IRCC that grants the permanent residence, but what the province can do is create programs to help facilitate that process of applying for permanent residence. And so what that means is every province is different in terms of the programs, in terms of the streams, the eligibility criteria, the process. Every province creates their own programs to help facilitate permanent residence. And so anytime you're applying through a provincial nominee program, you're always looking at a multiple step process. Okay, the first step is going to be going through the provincial route, applying to the province, getting a nomination from the province. And the second step is going to be applying for permanent residence to IRCC. So you want to keep in mind that this is not just as simple as applying to the province and getting your permanent residence. There's always going to be multiple steps involved in here. The second thing to keep in mind when you're going through the provincial nominee programs is that you have to have an intent to live and work in that province. Now, what does that mean? Well, when you're applying for permanent residence through a provincial program, you need to actually want to live and work in that province, okay? If you're applying for permanent residence through, let's say, Saskatchewan's PNP program, but you're buying a house, your spouse is living in, you're buying a house in Ontario, your spouse is living in Ontario, you're only applying for jobs in Ontario, it's very clear that your intent is not to reside in Saskatchewan, okay? And so that goes back to, should you be applying for the provincial nominee program or not? Okay, in that case, we would probably say no, look at something else, okay? But once you become a permanent resident, you have mobility rights. And so once you're a permanent resident, you are able to move to a different province. It's not to say that once you're a permanent resident, because you applied for you got your PR through a provincial nominee program, you're now stuck in that province forever. Absolutely not. Let's say you become a permanent resident 6 months down the line, you know, you applied through Saskatchewan, you got your PR through the Saskatchewan PNP, but you get a fantastic job offer in Ontario 6 months later after you become a permanent resident. You have the ability to move at that point in time, okay? It really comes back to what was your intent during that application process, okay? Also with PNP programs, and again, I'm not going to go through every province's programs right now, but what you want to keep in mind is the actual stream that you're applying through. Generally, all the provinces have programs that work with Express Entry and those that work outside of Express Entry. And so when you're looking at applying through a provincial program, it's really important to know which of these streams you're applying through. Are you applying through one that works with or outside of Express Entry? The reason that that's so important is that only the Express Entry streams that the province have will give you the additional 600 points in the pool, okay? If you get a nomination through a non-Express Entry stream, then when you're applying for your permanent residence, you can't put that nomination certificate in your Express Entry profile and say, okay, now I want the 600 points. I want to convert this to an Express Entry nomination. That is not going to work, okay? Your application will get refused. In order to qualify for the 600 points, the stream that you apply through the province does have to be an Express Entry stream. If it's not, then you're applying directly for your permanent residence through what IRCC calls a base application. And the biggest difference between the Express Entry and the non-Express Entry is the processing times. So Express Entry follows the Express Entry processing times. You apply to the province, you get approved by the province, you get your 600 points. You're probably going to get your invitation in the next draw. You apply for permanent residence, and the processing time is supposed to be on average 6 months. If you go through the non-Express Entry route, so you apply to the province, you get your nomination, you can't use it for Express Entry, so you're applying directly for your permanent residence through the base application process. Right now, the average processing time is 2 years. Okay, so very significant in terms of what that processing time difference is. Keep in mind, your intent has to be to stay in that province. throughout that entire application process. So again, going back to our example, if you are going through one of the base categories, but in between you decide to move out of the province, you're essentially maybe forfeiting your permanent residence application and need to start again. Okay, so really important to keep all of this in mind as you're navigating the immigration system and deciding how to apply for permanent residence. And with that, I'm going to open it up to questions.
Ziah, thank you so much for such a comprehensive understanding of all those aspects and all those stages that we would be experiencing. So I will start with some of the questions that have come in previously prior to our session, and I'll also give you a chance to kind of look through what's in the Q&A. And I'll start with one that came in prior to our session. A student was asking, I graduated in August 2022 and applied for my PGWP, my postgraduate work permit, on September 1st, 2022. I have not received my PGWP yet. My study permit will expire on November 30th, today. I applied for a student visa in June 2022, but instead received a visitor visa that expires in 2026. My first question, so that's the context. My first question is whether I will be able to travel abroad and return to Canada after my study permit expires today, while I am waiting for the PGWP. And then the second question is, once I have the PGWP, should I apply for a work visa based on it, or can I travel back and forth with my valid visiting visa?
Okay, so what happened during COVID is that IRCC, so normally pre-COVID, you would apply for your TRV based on the permit that you held, right? So if you held a work permit, you needed to have a visa that said you're a worker, okay? What happened during COVID is that IRCC basically made, so to try and reduce the number of applications and the number of passports that had to get submitted, IRCC basically said a visa is a visa is a visa. So if you have a TRV, but it's not issued based on your work permit, you don't have, and it's, for example, in this case, issued on a visitor status or visitor, you don't necessarily have to get a new TRV in order to be able to travel. Okay, and today that still remains true. So I think I'm answering the second question first here, but when that PGWP is issued, you don't have to go and get a new TRV that says worker on it in order to be able to return to Canada. Now, going back to the first question of traveling while you're waiting for the postgrad work permit to be issued, the general rule that IRCC has is that you can travel, re-enter, as long as you have a valid study permit. Okay, so in this case, the study permit's has expired. IRCC does have a policy in place for international graduates in this exact situation. Study permit's been expired, has applied for the postgrad work permit, but has a TRV. They can re-enter Canada as a visitor and work without a work permit while waiting for the postgrad to be processed. With that being said, yes, IRCC says this. Yes, it's on the website. It's all there. However, in practice, generally my recommendation is to not travel while you're waiting for that postgrad work permit, because when you're re-entering Canada, it is at the discretion of the officer, right? You have an officer who does not understand, who does not know, and this is not just in Canada, because remember, you have to try and board your flight from your other country too. What we see happen sometimes is that don't understand, say, you know what, you don't have valid status, we're not allowing you to travel to Canada. So it can become complicated in that sense, and generally my recommendation is to not travel, but IRCC does have the policy there. It is on their website that you can travel while you're waiting for your postgrad to be issued.
Thank you, Ziah. And I just want to remind folks who have put questions in the chat, please put those in the Q&A function, because I cannot refer to the chat for the questions. I will only look at the Q&A. And I have another question from a person who emailed prior to our session. So after applying for a PGWP, how many years of open work permit should I receive after graduating from my 2 years college program? So I know you've answered that question and it was 3 years. If it's a
Correct.
2-year program, you can have it up to 3 years. So
Correct.
my ears were open. Okay. What are the implications, if any, of applying for a common law visa while on a postgraduate work permit? Would I still be able to work while the sponsorship application is processed?
Yes. So the second part of that question, yes, you can work, you can apply for a spousal sponsorship. In terms of implications, in terms of how that would all look for the person who's asked the question specifically, what I would recommend, and I mean, keep in mind, I can only answer general questions today. I can't answer anything specific. How is it going to apply to me? What do I need to do? What I recommend and what I think is very important for anyone who is navigating the system is speak with an immigration lawyer who can sit down, who can go through your background specifically, talk about how everything applies to you, what we do during our consultations with clients is we actually create an immigration plan that's really tailored to your needs, to your background, right? And I think that's very important because, there's a lot of different programs out there. Really figuring out which ones apply to you, what makes the most sense for you, and how to navigate all of that is going to be specific to your circumstances. It's not going to be general. Everything is there. There's lots of information online, but how to really tailor that to you and how to navigate that. I really think you do need to sit down with a lawyer who can go through that with you.
And this person had a few other questions that are very specific, and some of them have already been answered by your session, Ziah. But one question that I think would still be relevant for folks is under the Canadian experience class, the 12 months of work, do those also have to be continuous?
No.
Okay, because I know you mentioned that they could be added up over so over 3 years, it has to be a total of 1 year,
Correct.
without having it be continuous.
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So you're adding different, you can add different occupations together. It can be with breaks. That's all fine.
And the processing time for getting a work permit after applying for the PGWP?
It'll always vary. Right now, it's about 5.5 months.
Awesome. So I'll go ahead into the Q&A. Now we're closing in on time. Ziah, what is it that you usually do? We have 20 questions that are in the Q&A. How does it usually work with you?
Well, if you're
in these
okay, I can stay
sessions?
a couple extra minutes and we can just try and get through as many of these as we can.
Okay, let's see how we can get some yes and no answers in this. So if you have been nominated for PR by a province via the PNP stream, is it true that if you leave the province after you get your PR, you will have issues in this future when it comes to your citizenship? They've been getting conflicting advice. I know you've spoken to this. Is there anything additional you'd like to add there?
No, again, after you've become a permanent resident, you have mobility rights. So moving around is fine. It really comes back to what your intent was and what you were doing while you're applying for permanent residence. And again, with that being said, if you get permanent residence January 1st and January 2nd, you pack up your bags and move to a different province, they're going to have a question about your intent during your process, right? But I mean, if something comes up 6 months later, a year later, whatever, that's fine.
Great. Can I work while I wait for my work permit?
I'm assuming that the individual is asking about the postgrad work permit. So yes, you can work while you wait for your postgrad work permit, as long as you held a study permit on the day you applied for your postgrad work permit.
Okay. I am an international student currently studying in a 1-year postgraduate program. If I start my second program after 2 or 3 months gap, will it affect my work permit? I heard sometimes you can get a 3-month work permit if you have a gap in the studies.
So keep in mind, we talked about doing 2 programs, right? If you are, if you've basically already been accepted into the second program, you hold your valid study permit or you've applied for an extension of your study permit, you're able to work full-time between your programs, right?
But if there's a gap,
as long as the gap is no longer than 150 days.
Great.
Yeah.
That answers it. Fantastic. And man, we're going good. All right. What could be the new knock for a product manager in apps tech banking? It has nothing to do with sales or marketing. I noticed that on the tier section. And so I'll ask that question first.
Sure. Yeah. So anytime we're talking about NOCs, when we're looking at which one to fall under, I mean, it really is, I don't really look at the position title as much. I more or less look at what the duties are of the role. And so what you want to focus on is going onto the NOC website, looking at different possible codes, but really focusing on what the duties are and what the lead statement is to determine where you exactly fall into.
Great. Can two simultaneous full-time Canadian jobs be used for express entry to add up to a year of work?
So I'll answer this a different way. When we're talking about that 1 year of work experience, IRCC is not only just looking at the hours, but they're also looking at that you need a calendar year. So the definition of 1 year is broken up really into two different parts. You need 1,560 hours. You also need a calendar year of work, right? So if someone is working 60 hours a week, that doesn't mean that they'll be able to apply or that they'll have their year of experience in 6 months. They would still have to wait the full year before they have their year of work experience.
Very clear. All right. While working full-time with the PGWP, can I travel out of the country? Okay, we've answered that question. And will it affect my future application to apply for PR?
So I do want to speak to this a little bit because Canadian experience class, right now we're in this world where we can do remote work, right? All the companies have moved into having some element of remote work. But IRCC has not kept up with this. Okay, so for Canadian experience class, when you're applying through Express Entry and you're claiming points for your Canadian work experience, that work experience, whether it's remote or not, needs to be in Canada. So if you're working remotely from your home country, that period of time will be deducted or can be deducted from your year.
Even if it's for a Canadian company?
Even if it's for a Canadian company. So yes, you can travel. Yes, you can come back, assuming you have your postgrad. If you need a visa, you have your visa or your ETA. But keep in mind that period of time, if you're working remotely for a Canadian company from outside of Canada, that can affect your eligibility, your points. Now, whether or not it's going to in every instance, that's up to the officer, but it can. IRCC does have the ability to remove that from your year of experience.
And they'll know because you have a stamp in your passport. And the period, wanting to flip that question that I was asking about, if it's a Canadian company, if it's not a Canadian company and you're in Canada working remotely for a non-Canadian company, can that also count towards your 1 year?
No, it wouldn't count towards Canadian work experience.
Because it's not for a Canadian company, even though you're sitting at home in Canada. Great.
Yeah.
All right. I'm studying in Canada or college and my program is for 1 year. My study permit will be expiring on 31st March, but my course is completing on 30th April. These are all in 2023. My question is, if I'm going to apply for study visa extension, is it for only 1 month? And after that course, I will be taking another 1 year program so that I can be eligible for the 3 years work permit. So again, I have to extend my study visa. So,
okay, so I'm going to break
what
that
happens
down.
in that 1 month?
Yeah, I'm going to break that down into two parts. So if we look at the first part, where you have your study permit expiring a month before you're going to actually finish your program, you can submit an extension application and ask for a 4-month extension, because technically, whenever you're asking for a study permit, you do want to give yourself IRCC can give up to a 3-month grace period following the end of the expected end of your program, right? So when you're applying for your first extension, it doesn't have to be just till April 30th. You can do April, May, June, July. So July 30th, right? To give yourself the 90-day period. That's to allow you to apply for your postgrad work permit. Now, at the time of your extension application, if you've already been accepted into the second program, you can apply to extend not just for that 4-month period, but for the full second program as well. If you haven't been accepted yet, then yes, you may be looking at doing 2 different extension applications.
Great. But still, for that first one, it should be like, give yourself the 3-month grace period.
Yeah, I mean, you want to make sure you have to have a study permit. You have to be able to have the authorization while you're here.
Great. While on PGWP, if we get a job offer of LMIA approved employer, will it give 50 points in the express entry, or LMIA jobs have a different work permit? I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you?
Yeah, I think this is, again, going back to the arranged employment points. So yes, when we talk about arranged employment, we talk about those points for job offer. If you have an LMIA, if your employer has done an LMIA for you, then yes, you'd be able to get the additional 50 points in express entry for that category. I'm going to skip this one because we've answered it.
Okay. If we have experience in 2 NOC, one is in NOC 0 and NOC B, will it be considered an express entry?
Yeah, you can combine different occupations for Canadian experience class.
Great. Yeah, this one, must I apply for my PGWP at the end of my academic program, or is it possible to apply before my academic program finishes?
You have to finish your program.
Okay, that indication from the school has to come in.
Mm-hmm.
Great. If I was a supervisor in my home country and became an analyst here, can I claim points for my old job even though they're different NOCs? They're both tier 1 and 2.
Yep. Yeah,
Great.
so in the comprehensive ranking system, so when we look at the points, there's different point categories for work experience in Canada and outside of Canada. They don't have to be related in terms of your positions or your education. None of that has to be related. It's just whether or not it's high skilled.
And for arranged employment, which you were talking about earlier, do we need employer-specific work permits, or will the PGWP, like I guess in this case, the PGWP is not acceptable?
That's correct. Yeah. So when we talk about arranged employment again, we look at either an LMIA, the employer's done an LMIA, or you're on a closed work permit. So not a postgrad work permit. A postgrad is an open work permit. Okay.
Would I be able to travel to my home country after I get the PGWP? My current visa is valid till September 23. Would I need to apply for the visit visa once my study finishes in April 2023 and I am on my postgraduate work permit? So all that to say, it seems like it's just, can I travel once they have the postgraduate work permit, they can travel.
Yeah, so I think this is just about the visa again. So, right now the policy is your visa is your visa is your visa. It doesn't have to be based on the work permit itself.
Okay. I'll be graduating next semester and I have 2 questions. Should I do an express entry profile just in case? And should I do a master's first, then admit for a PR, or should I work and get a PR, then get a master's degree? Maybe this is like a little too specific, but
yeah. So this is one of those questions that we would be, my recommendation would be to schedule a consultation appointment. During that, we'll be able to go through your background and decide what makes the most sense for you.
Great. And even the folks who have asked about fees around consultations, they can definitely reach out and get some more information from you based on that. If we have 1 year full-time job in NOC A, will we be eligible for express entry because of getting the 600 score? I'm guessing the 600 is in relation to the provincial nomination program.
Yeah, so if you have a year of full-time work experience in NOC A, in terms of eligibility, you may be eligible, but again, it's not just about being eligible, it's about having the points that you need to actually get selected. Hard to say whether or not you particularly would be selected. We'd have to, again, schedule a consultation, go through your background, and decide what makes the most sense.
Great. Is the work permit of your spouse valid while the student is applying for postgraduate work permit?
Yeah, so when we talk about spousal open work permits, your spouse, while you're a student, does get an open work permit that allows them to work. That work permit remains valid whether or not you're studying. So if you finish your program early, they have a work permit that's valid for another 2 years, for example, based on your program. They can continue working using that work permit. That does not become invalid the same way that your study permit does.
Great. And we're down to our last 2, Ziah. I have been working as a web developer part-time since January 2022. I'm on a student visa and I'm going to graduate in this December. Since I can't work for a few weeks until I apply for the work permit after I complete my first semester exam, is that considered as a gap? Would it be counted as experience while applying for federal skills worker program?
Yeah, so that would be a gap. If we're talking about applying through the federal skilled worker program, you need a year continuous. That would basically work against that. And so it would be a problem if you're trying to apply through federal skilled worker. Now, because you're a student while you're getting this work experience, that work experience would not qualify you under Canadian experience class. So it does become a bit of an issue, unfortunately.
Right. If it's, if I can add something to that, if they take some time off, like leave days from work, that's not considered a gap though, right?
It depends, right? Depends on how long. So if they're taking regular vacation time, let's say, you regularly have 2 weeks of vacation, so you're not considered to have left your employment, you're just taking your regular vacation period, that's fine, right? Because there's no break in your employment continues.
Still employed, but not working because I'm on leave to prepare for my exams, for example. Yeah. Okay. Hope that answered the question for Rahil. All right. So last one, I was looking at master's stream for applying for my PR. Is the process slower than express entry?
Yeah, so just to give some context to the rest of the people who are on this webinar, the master stream was talking about the OINP program. OINP Ontario has a master stream in their provincial nominee program. Yes, it is slower than express entry because it is a non-express entry route. So basically you'd be applying through the base program. So like we were talking about, the average processing time for the second stage, the permanent residence, is about 2 years. I am seeing some come back faster, but generally the processing time is longer.
And this next question about what's the minimum course to be a full-time student status, that's dependent on the school, right?
Correct.
Great. And Ziah, we had a few questions in the chat, and I know I didn't want to ask anything there, but there was a lot in relation to co-op, being a co-op student and co-op work permits. So I'll just start with one of them, is that if we have a co-op work permit given in immigration when we enter Canada, is that already valid for our work permit after graduation?
No, so the co-op work permit is specific to your co-op position, right?
And that's not considered as a gap in your studies, right? You're still a full-time student as a
co-op. When you're a co-op student, no, schools still consider you to be a full-time student while you're in your co-op semester.
Great. Yeah. And after using our co-op work permit is finished, and we still did not reach the experience. Okay, so if I'm doing a co-op, does that count towards, that's still me, a full-time student, wouldn't count towards my Canadian experience class. Great, but it can count towards federal work.
There you go.
If I was doing it continuously for 1 year. Okay. Yeah. So I derail. So using our co-op work permit, if our co-op work permit is finished and we did not reach the experience, what's the best option to extend our stay to reach the Canadian experience? I think that's
question.
Yeah.
Great question. Again, this will be very much dependent on your particular circumstances. So what I can recommend, contact an immigration lawyer who can go through it. Certainly you can contact me. I'm happy to schedule a consultation appointment for you. What I'll do is I'll put my email address here in the chat. But yeah, basically you're looking for a personalized plan. It's not just one general answer for everyone.
Okay. And then the last co-op related question was also like, they have a study permit, don't have a work permit for the co-op. How can they apply?
They need to apply two parts to that.
They have a study permit, but not the work permit.
Yeah. So if you're doing a co-op semester, which means you have to be able to work full time, then, you do need a co-op work permit unless you fall under unless you fall under the temporary policy right now, which allows you to work full time. If you are able to work full time under the temporary policy, then you can do your co-op using that temporary policy without needing a co-op work permit. Otherwise, you need a co-op work permit.
Great. And with that, Ziah, I'm just going to quickly close out our session. Just give me a second Great. So, folks, thank you so much for being with us today. Ziah, thank you so much for your time and all your efficiency in answering like the 25 plus questions we had. And folks, we have huge opportunities for you to continue engagement. Next week, we have Wednesday, December 7th, we have our expert panel, Careers in Cryptocurrency and Blockchain. December 14th, workshop in building your network, which is very important. And Wednesday, December 21st, Devant Christmas Social with career coaches. So we welcome everyone to join us. Thank you all for all your questions and your comments. We have shared a lot of links and resources in the chat. Please do reach out. Thank you everyone for staying back with us, and we're really hoping that you have best of luck with your processes going forward. Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Ziah.